So welcome to today's Hacktober presentation. I hope you guys are enjoying the series of speakers. It's a pretty cool collection, so I'm hoping to keep up with the talent so far. So today I'm going to be talking about our plan to improve the overall security program here in the state. So my focus is really trying to bring us from just being compliant with policy and standards, which is an important baseline, certainly, to being aware of the risks that we're actually mitigating. So we can be more creative and agile in the way that we address those risks. And that will be a journey over the next, I'd say, 2 or 3 years. But I wanted to paint that roadmap so everyone here has an idea, and you can share the message with your peers. I want this to be an interactive session. I've got about half an hour of content, so we definitely have room for questions. So please feel free to interject, and there'll be moments during the presentation that I may actually seek your input. So let's get rolling. So to me, it's really cool to bring in a study to illustrate some of the ideas, seeing as risk management isn't a formal practice established here in the States. I'm going to be bringing in a story about an adventure I had to a waterfall in Honduras in Central America, and showing how, without me really realizing it, I was using the principles of risk management to do that safely, to actually go to the base of a waterfall. And I want to connect that to, okay, well, here's how your agencies can actually use this within their environment, and connect it with some frameworks that are out there that we can leverage, and give you a call to action, and then open the floor to questions. So based on my research, there are 4 broad requirements to a risk-aware agency community. First off, you need to have risk ownership. So you have to have someone in a position of authority that can actually make the tough choices in response to risk. Second, you have to have a uniform framework for the management of that risk and for the assessment of the risk. It's not very useful when you have one agency doing it one way and another agency doing it a whole different way, because then you really can't talk to each other and understand if there is a systemic risk at play. You need to have a risk focus. And what I mean by that is not just being focused on what you have to do, but what you should do to address the risks to your agency's mission. And lastly, treat compliance as a baseline. It certainly is important, as I started talking about in the intro slide. But compliance was derived from an analysis of a very large population, and it does not reflect your unique risks. The people over at NIST or CISA don't know what's happening at DSHS. They don't know what's happening at HTA. They don't know your risks. They're just saying, well, here's some recommendations based on this broad collection of risks that may or may not be relevant to you. Do you think that we have that here in the state currently? Is there anyone here that wants to answer that question? Which one of these factors do you think we have right now? And that was a question to the audience. Feel free to respond. Karen, what do you think? You do a lot of the audits here. Do you think we have these in place?
From what we were seeing, no. We don't have the individual considerations. I think it's done probably informally and ad hoc, but not formally.
So clearly we have some opportunities here for improvement. So let's start off with a story. So for about 3 years in the late 80s, I worked in Central America. And this is where that waterfall adventure happened. I was there teaching English and computer science. And I learned about this really cool waterfall that's about 15 feet shorter than Niagara Falls. So it's a pretty sizable waterfall. And I've always been an adventurer at heart. I was in my late 20s, so I felt very bold, and I wanted to take this challenge. So here's a photograph of the waterfall. Clearly, it's a little bit intimidating. The photograph doesn't really capture it, so let's take a look at a video. So the rocks are where I was actually shooting to get to. So I wanted to get to the place where these rocks are at the base of the waterfall. Pretty amazing, huh? So why would I do this? Well, as I mentioned, I was very bold in my youth. Still am kind of bold, but not quite as bold as I was, and I wanted to be able to say that I had done that. But I recognized that I'd never been to a waterfall before. It's probably has some dangers, some hazards to deal with. So I wanted to prepare myself. And I definitely did not want to get hurt. So I knew I had to do some research into what it would take to do this safely. So much of what I went into this just with my own knowledge, and I had to recognize what hazards that I have to deal with. So using risk language, here are some of the threats I had to deal with. So jagged gorge walls. As we saw in that video, the gorge walls are carved out by the waterfall and the rapids that goes through there. So falling into there, you could definitely get hurt. Waterfall hydraulics, you don't really see that, but at the base of most waterfalls, there are underwater caves that can suck you under and you'll get stuck there and drown. There are ledges that go to where I was aiming at, but they were higher up and they were very wet and treacherous, depending on what time of year there was. You really couldn't see during the rainy season what was underwater. So there could be logs or rocks that if you fell in the wrong place, you can get hurt. But it's a waterfall, so you could have falling debris like sticks and animals. I mean, all sorts of things that could actually hit you, and it would not be a good day. So, from a vulnerability perspective, of course, we're human beings, so we're vulnerable to blunt to sharp force trauma. I had never done this before, so hey, from lack of experience, I could just make poor decisions, and depending on where I was, I could get stuck in a spray of water and get disoriented and not know where I was and move in the wrong direction or make the wrong choices. So I started doing some research. Okay, research. What are some things that I can do to mitigate the chance of me actually being hurt? So you can think of these as controls, maybe things you would see in the version of 14110 for waterfalls. So a lot of these things are very generic guidance. Okay, here are some good things to do for a waterfall, but these weren't written for that waterfall. In Central America, in a rainforest environment. So yeah, these are good practices, but they may not exactly have helped me. So these were my baseline. So tell me, if you were me today, would this be enough information for you to go ahead and make that hike to the base of a waterfall? And no brave souls here, so I'm guessing the answer would be no. And that was my case as well. So I wanted to do some additional research. So I formed a team of people that had been there before, because I knew there was probably some specific information I had to gather about this particular waterfall. So, yep, there was a lot more data here. So there were times a year that it's not a good idea to do what I want to do. So between October and February, they have rain almost every day. So the path I was going to follow was vulnerable to landslides. The ledge I was going to follow was very slick. It might fall beneath me. The water level was about 5 feet higher in the rapids, and there was a lot more debris coming down the waterfall. I learned that there were definitely certain sections of the waterfall to avoid where my team knew where there were definite dangers, such as the waterfall hydraulics and underwater logs and rocks. But also I learned that every year about 15 to 20 people die at that waterfall. And I learned the circumstances behind their deaths. So I knew that there were certain choices not to make and certain paths not to take. So I had to really balance between safety and maneuverability. I couldn't be so weighed down by safety equipment such as flotation gear or headgear or gloves or footgear that would limit my ability to maneuver the gorge. I had to make choices in what I was going to wear in order to minimize the danger of falling. So I had to be very selective in my footwear and gloves. And I had to learn how to negotiate a cliff wall. So I had to go train in places that had like climbing walls, things like that. And I learned that carelessness leads to injury or death. So I learned, okay, these were the basic things I had to focus on in my preparation for this mission. So I found out that really among all these vulnerabilities, things that could go wrong, there were really two risks I had to really worry about and manage, was injury or death. Those were the two things I really had to worry about and build my plan of approach and control to deal with. So what's important here in terms of connecting it back to what you do day to day is you receive a litany of vulnerability reports from either external source or internally through WATAC. While these things are certainly important, what does it really mean to your agency's risk? What risks are getting in the way of your agency's ability to serve its constituents? And what impact does that vulnerability actually have? So that is the tough part of risk management, is trying to connect risk to threat and vulnerability and actually make choices that are not centered on what the vulnerability is, but what the risk is. So my preparation, physical and mental training, as I've already alluded to, I did a lot of training on climbing walls at various, at a couple of gyms in San Francisco, which is where I was working, but also did a great deal of meditation and trying to gain a certain level of mental focus, which, as I'll describe, became very useful to me. I also chose to get very minimal equipment because I wanted to optimize my ability to negotiate the environment. So I only chose 3 pieces of protective equipment. So water shoes, they were very, very slim, and I could almost feel the surface I was walking on. A flotation vest in case I fell into the rapids, and headgear to protect my head against harm. I could have purchased more protective gear around my arms or my legs, but that would have separated my body more from the cliff wall and gotten in the way of my ability to complete my mission and put me at additional hazard, additional risk of falling into the river or getting injured otherwise. So the compensating control I came up with was I hired a on-site team of 2 people to monitor my progress through the waterfall. In case something happened, do first aid and call medical support. I also started to go, went there about 3 times before the actual mission to go to the base of the waterfall to do some intel around the area to identify what path I was going to take. Then came the day of truth. So I had done all these risk assessments essentially, but I knew that in that moment, I really couldn't do a brand new risk assessment because I was going to take a lot of time and I wanted to just get in there and do it. So I came up with risk indicators, 3 basic things that I could think of and keep an eye on as I did my mission. So that was there a question? Okay. And what's really important here is a risk assessment, and your agency will take some time, but it's a snapshot in time. It should not be done every time you're trying to serve a constituent, or if the conditions change, you have to do a brand new assessment. So the output of every risk assessment should be a set of risk indicators that you can use to respond to conditions in the environment dynamically, so you know what to do. So in this case, there were 3 things. I was looking for changes in the weather conditions that would impact the rapids or the cliff walls. I would look for signs in the cliff wall that the cliff wall was unstable in some way, either loose dirt or loose rocks. But also keep an eye on any dangerous animals in the area, because I knew that there were snakes, there were poisonous lizards there, as well as some dangerous mammals that will occasionally move along the waterfall area. So really, from all the work I had done, there were only 3 things that I had to worry about in that moment. Now, all this work allowed me to clear my mind and be very observant, because I was only had to worry about 3 things. I became very attuned to the environment. And what I hadn't noticed before was that the walls the gorge walls were covered in a thick combination of lichen and moss. They were woven into each other. And when I grabbed onto it, my hands sunk into this mass that felt like hundreds of little suction cups. And it was almost all the way to the area where I was heading towards. So I was able to use these as a purchase in order to secure my transit to my goal. If I hadn't done this work, all this preparation, I wouldn't have recognized the potential of what the environment had to offer. So finally made it to the base of the waterfall, and I looked up and saw the most amazing thing I'd ever seen was a circular waterfall. Sorry, a circular rainbow. Something that only happens at waterfalls. Now, one point that I meant to say that as I made my way through this along the gorge walls, one of the guys I had hired to follow my path to keep an eye on me was telling me about all the people that had died doing the very same thing I was doing. So the connection to an agency is when you get threat intel, you're always going to see things that on the surface may be alerting or scaring in some way. You might get reports from WATEC saying, or CISA, hey, this is really scary. You need to take time to really analyze how that really impacts the risk of your agency and respond in that way. So how do we actually use this in our day-to-day jobs? So first off, you really need to put together a risk team, just like I did. So for threat information, you're going to get stuff from security operations. Right now, Jeff Jordan shares a lot of intel from security operations on threats as well as vulnerabilities. But the actual risk of what these things actually mean are going to come from either your agency management or from the Enterprise Security Governance Council. People that actually understand the business of either your agency or how your agency fits into the state ecosystem. That's where the risk needs to be communicated and responded to. The threat and vulnerabilities are important inputs, certainly, but you need to meet with your business impact team to figure out what it actually means to you. And that's where the risk assessment service that WATEC has will be useful. And we currently have in review a risk management policy, which we'll be publishing in the new year, but we also have a risk management work group. And we're definitely working to provide the agency's tools to be able to do this. So some of you may recognize this from previous presentations I've done. The NIST Cybersecurity Framework, or CSF, provides a really good way to perceive and act on threats, vulnerabilities, and managing risks. So we have at the program level, the more strategic level, we have the framework core, which we'll discuss in the next slide. We have a set of controls. This is from the Center of Area Security, or CIS. And the IGs are short for implementation groups. And the way we're treating it there is depending on what kind of data, whether you're dealing with Cat 1, 2, or 3, or 4, you would fall into specific implementation groups, generally speaking. But also in terms of where your agency is with its risk management maturity, you would fit into a tier and a risk profile. So let's dive into those. So at the functional level, this is your strategy level where you're talking with your agency heads, like the CIOs and director level people. These are your very strategy level risk areas. So if a risk is in the way of us identifying our assets or identifying what assets are actually serving constituents, clearly we need to take care of that. If there's a risk that is getting in the way of us protecting our data or detecting threats, this level allows you to communicate up to those people that are responsible for agency strategy. But as you get down to more the tactical teams that actually do the work, you look at categories. So these are the tactical steps that you need to take to deal with the strategic level risk communications. So Protect would deal with identity access management, awareness training, data security. So let's say that there was a impact to data security, you could work with your data team and interact with either the people responsible for encryption or with the privacy office for any privacy controls. And then further, the subcategories, this might look very similar to what you would see in the current 140.110, which would be specific control statements. Here you would see, okay, well, a standard or policy is telling us to do this. This is the level of that control, the very operational level language. And the informational references allow you to see, okay, well, what controls do I have to implement in my environment? Now, the beauty of this framework is it ties everything from strategy all the way down to operational control guidance. So you're able to communicate back and forth and respond to risk in a very dynamic way. One thing that we're working towards right now as we revise the structure of 140.110, each policy and standard will be mapped to this framework. So you're able to look at a standard or policy and know where it sits in this hierarchy.
Just wondering about how we talk about comprehensive risk management.
I'm sorry, could you speak up, please? Was that you, Wesley? Sorry, Wesley Thorpe. Now, the cybersecurity framework tiers, this talks about the level of maturity of your organization. Most agencies in the state that I've, based on the information I've seen, fall within tier 1, where per Karen's earlier comment, things are done very ad hoc. There's no formal process for managing risk. Our goal for the next 2 years is to move the state towards a risk-informed tier for all agencies. And what that means is that every agency within the next 2 years will be aware of its risks and start to implement that awareness across their whole program. There's definitely work to get there, but I'm confident that by leveraging this framework in combination with the NIST risk management framework, which we'll discuss next, we can certainly get there. So this is the basis of our risk management policy, which is currently in review. Much of the work that we do with security design review and the steps that we take before we make a system live fall into that categorized step. And then we move on to the control selection to mitigate any risks that come out of were identified during the SDR or during the risk assessment process. Control implementation, control assessment. The agency itself then says, okay, everything's in place, let's go ahead and make this live, and then we monitor the controls. And as we'll see, the monitoring piece is where those risk indicators and control indicators, which we'll discuss soon, come in. And that will allow you not to have to do a risk assessment every year. You could do one every 3 years, depending on how risky your system is to the state. So risk monitoring is a very important piece following a risk assessment. Risk indicators will both the risk indicator and control indicator will be derived from a risk assessment, but a risk indicator will allow you to see a risk that either occurred in the case of a lagging indicator or a risk that is about to occur. So a leading indicator would be an early warning system. And the risk management office will certainly, the risk management practice will certainly help agencies in coming up with risk indicators. Control indicators are also useful because they allow you to see, okay, you've implemented a set of controls, but how well do they perform over time? And one of the basic set of controls you want to monitor are those dealing with user access, user authentication and authorization, as well as your vulnerability status. You're monitoring the effectiveness of those controls is important to mitigating the odds of a risk event actually occurring. So I've got three items here as a call to action to everyone in this meeting. You need to identify and form a risk team within your agency. This is important because you need to pay attention to your risks, not rely on generic controls from 140, 110, or any other framework. Those are simply a baseline. They're important. You should comply with them. However, there's more to it than that. You need to understand where you are right now, and we can certainly help you do that, because that will tell you, okay, here's where you are right now, but based on your program, you may decide, well, Steve, we don't want to go much past level 2. We're fine at level 2. Or if you have higher requirements, let's say that you're processing category 4 data, you may want to go to a level 3, a tier 3 or a tier 4 level of maturity because of your mandates from, say, the IRS. And we can certainly help you determine that and give you a roadmap to do that. But I opened up with a waterfall story because it's important to make risk tangible, because it's hard to react to risk if it's ephemeral and people don't understand exactly what the risk means. So find a way to communicate risk internally to your teams that is tangible, that actually says, okay, if this system goes down, these constituents will be harmed, or we won't be able to serve this group of people. That way, you're not just dealing with ideas of risk, it's real. And communicating that up to the risk management group will help us help you. Are there any questions? Well, one of the common questions I get is, what if everything is a risk? And that's a really tough question because I can see how someone might perceive that. But if everything is a risk, you either have to question, okay, how are you identifying that? And take another look at it, criteria for that risk. Or you need to take a look at, why is my practice or my organization so susceptible to risk? If everything is a risk, it's kind of hard for you to operate. Paul, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question. In your experience, do you feel that a lot of projects are scrapped because of the fear of risk management mitigation or risk mitigation? So, where, yes, we've identified the risk, but rather than mitigate that risk, we just say, oh, we don't want to deal with that risk, so we're scrapping this project.
Well, I've only been with Wadtech for 10 months, so I'm going to preface it by saying that, but I've seen that in my consulting practice earlier in my career. And typically what happens there is that risk isn't defined to a scope where it can actually be handled. It's way too high level. It's not, it isn't scoped appropriately, and the impact of that risk is not conveyed within the context of whatever the initiative is. So it's kind of out of whack. It tends to be overstated. So yeah, if you were to tell me that not using MFA on your project, I'm sorry, if you were to ask me for a waiver for MFA on something, but you have a really good compensating control, but I don't understand that, it isn't clear in the waiver, let's say, I may actually say, well, I'm not going to approve this waiver because I don't know why you're waiving MFA. But there's lots of ways to go around that depending on what the actual risk is. So mostly it's around being clear about the scope of the risk, where the impact actually is. And if you can't satisfy a compliance requirement, using that risk context to then justify, well, here's what we can do. And does that meet the spirit of the requirement? And that's where I see a lot of the NIST control tailoring recommendations go to, is if you understand your risk well enough, you can then tailor the controls if you can't strictly meet a requirement. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
So we still have a little bit over 15 minutes. Any other questions? Or would you like me to stop recording? You can ask questions.